George Washington's life stands as a cornerstone of American history and a testament to the power of character in shaping destiny. His pivotal choices, from surrendering his military command to presiding over the Constitutional Convention, reveal a complex interplay of virtue and pragmatism. In the rural landscape of Westmoreland County, Virginia, where the Potomac River flows gently into the Chesapeake Bay, George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, to Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. The family's plantation, Ferry Farm, nestled along the Rappahannock River, would serve as the young George's childhood home, shaping his early experiences and influences. Augustine, a justice of the peace and a planter of moderate means, had previously been married to Jane Butler, with whom he had two sons, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., before her untimely death. The Washington family was part of the colonial gentry, with roots tracing back to England, where their ancestors had been modest landowners. However, it was in the New World that they sought to establish themselves as prominent members of society. George's father, Augustine, had inherited a significant portion of land from his own father, making him a respectable figure in the community. The family's social standing and economic security would have a profound impact on George's upbringing and future ambitions. As a child, George was particularly close to his older half-brother Lawrence, who had been educated in England and served in the British Navy. Lawrence's stories of adventure and military service would later inspire George's own desire for exploration and leadership. The Washington household was also marked by a strong sense of duty and responsibility, with Augustine instilling in his children the importance of hard work, honesty, and integrity. Growing up at Ferry Farm, George developed a deep appreciation for the outdoors and a strong work ethic, often assisting his father with the management of their plantation. His early education was overseen by his mother, who ensured that he received a basic grounding in reading, writing, and arithmetic. However, it was through his interactions with the natural world, rather than formal schooling, that George's curiosity and observational skills were honed. One revealing anecdote from George's childhood highlights his developing character. At the age of 6 or 7. He was given a small hatchet as a gift, which he used to chop down a cherry tree in their orchard. When confronted by his father about the damage, George confessed to the deed, demonstrating an early commitment to honesty and accountability. This incident, though seemingly trivial, speaks to the values that would come to define George's life: integrity, responsibility, and a willingness to accept the consequences of one's actions. As George entered his teenage years, his family's circumstances underwent significant changes. His father's death in 1743 left the family without a patriarch, and his mother, Mary, was tasked with managing the plantation and raising their children alone. Lawrence, now a veteran of the British Navy, played an increasingly influential role in George's life, encouraging his younger brother to pursue a career in surveying. This profession, which involved mapping and measuring land, would not only provide George with a practical skill, but also foster his interest in exploration and territorial expansion. As George's interest in surveying grew, he began to accompany his brother Lawrence on expeditions to the wilderness areas of Virginia, where they would map out tracts of land for wealthy colonists. One such expedition, undertaken in 1748, took them to the Shenandoah Valley, a vast and uncharted region that stretched as far as the eye could see. The experience had a profound impact on George, who was struck by the sheer scale and beauty of the American wilderness. He saw firsthand the endless possibilities for expansion and development that lay before them, and his mind began to turn towards the potential for exploration and settlement. It was during this period that George's relationship with Lord Fairfax, a wealthy and influential landowner, began to take shape. Fairfax, who owned vast tracts of land in the Shenandoah Valley, took a liking to the young Washington and saw potential in him as a surveyor. He offered George a position as his surveyor, tasked with mapping out the boundaries of his lands and identifying areas suitable for settlement. This appointment not only provided George with a steady income, but also gave him access to the highest echelons of Virginia society, where he would rub shoulders with men of power and influence. As George's skills as a surveyor improved, so too did his reputation. He became known throughout the colony as a diligent and meticulous worker, able to navigate the treacherous terrain of the wilderness with ease. His experiences in the field also taught him valuable lessons about leadership and decision-making, as he was often required to make difficult choices in the face of uncertainty. One such instance occurred in 1750, when George was tasked with surveying a tract of land that was disputed by rival claimants. He navigated the complex web of interests and alliances with skill, ultimately resolving the dispute through a combination of diplomacy and firmness. George's growing expertise as a surveyor also brought him into contact with other influential figures at the time, including Thomas Fairfax, Lord Fairfax's son. The two men formed a close friendship, bonding over their shared love of the outdoors and their passion for exploration. Through his relationship with Thomas, George gained access to a wider circle of acquaintances, including prominent politicians and military leaders. These connections would serve him well in the years to come, as he began to build a reputation as a man of integrity and ability. As the 1750s dawned, George's thoughts turned increasingly towards the military. He had always been fascinated by the stories of his brother Lawrence, who had served in the British Navy, and he saw the military as a way to distinguish himself and make a name for himself in the world. The outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754 provided him with the perfect opportunity to pursue his ambitions. George joined the Virginia militia as a major, tasked with helping to defend the colony against the threat of French and Native American attacks. It was a decision that would change the course of his life forever, setting him on a path that would lead him to greatness and ultimately make him one of the most famous men in American history. The war itself was a brutal and chaotic affair, with both sides committing atrocities and engaging in guerrilla warfare. George's experiences during this period were marked by hardship and danger, as he navigated the treacherous terrain of the frontier and clashed with enemy forces. One notable incident occurred in 1755, when George played a key role in the Battle of Fort Duquesne, a disastrous defeat for the British that resulted in the deaths of over 900 soldiers. Despite the setbacks, George emerged from the experience with his reputation intact, having demonstrated bravery and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. As the French and Indian War drew to a close, George's experiences had left an indelible mark on his character. The hardships he endured, the battles he fought, and the decisions he made had all contributed to the formation of a strong and resilient leader. In 1759, with the war finally subsiding, George returned to Virginia, where he was greeted as a hero. His reputation as a brave and capable military officer had preceded him, and he was hailed by his contemporaries as one of the most promising young men in the colony. Upon his return, George settled into a quieter life, focusing on managing his estate at Mount Vernon and pursuing his interests in agriculture and land development. He also began to take a more active role in Virginia politics, attending meetings of the House of Burgesses and forming alliances with influential figures such as George Mason and Richard Henry Lee. These relationships would prove invaluable in the years to come, as George navigated the complex web of colonial politics and began to build a reputation as a shrewd and effective leader. One of the most significant events of this period was George's marriage to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. The couple married in 1759, and their union brought together 2 of the most prominent families in Virginia. Martha's wealth and social standing helped to secure George's position in society, while his own reputation as a military hero and politician added to her prestige. Together, they formed a formidable partnership, with George handling the business and political aspects of their lives, while Martha managed the household and raised their children. As the 1760s dawned, George's attention turned increasingly towards the growing tensions between the colonies and Great Britain. The British government, seeking to recoup the costs of the French and Indian War, had begun to impose a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. These measures were deeply unpopular among the colonists, who saw them as an infringement on their rights as British subjects. George, like many of his contemporaries, was outraged by these developments, and he began to speak out against the British government's policies. In 1765, George was elected to the House of Burgesses, where he quickly became a leading voice in opposition to British rule. He formed close relationships with other prominent politicians, including Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, and together they worked to coordinate resistance to British taxation policies. One notable example of their efforts was the Virginia Resolves, a series of resolutions passed by the House of Burgesses in 1765, which declared that the colonists had the right to govern themselves and rejected the authority of the British Parliament to tax them. As tensions between the colonies and Great Britain continued to escalate, George found himself at the forefront of the growing resistance movement. In 1770, he was appointed to a committee tasked with drafting a response to the British government's latest round of taxation policies. The resulting document, known as the Virginia Remonstrance, was a scathing critique of British rule and a powerful statement of colonial rights. George's role in crafting this document helped to establish him as one of the leading voices in the Patriot movement, and it marked an important milestone on his path towards becoming the leader of the American Revolution. As the Virginia Remonstrance circulated throughout the colonies, George's reputation as a champion of American rights continued to grow. In 1772, he was appointed to a committee tasked with investigating the seizure of the colonial schooner Gaspee by British customs officials. The incident had sparked widespread outrage, and George's involvement in the investigation helped to further solidify his position as a leader in the Patriot movement. His careful examination of the evidence and his thoughtful questioning of witnesses demonstrated his commitment to fairness and justice, qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. In 1773, George's attention turned to the growing crisis surrounding the Tea Act, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing local merchants. The colonists saw this as a blatant attempt to exert control over their economy and undermine their rights as British subjects. As tensions escalated, George found himself at the forefront of the opposition, using his influence to coordinate resistance efforts throughout Virginia. His leadership helped to galvanize public opinion against the Tea Act, and on December 16, 1773, a group of patriots in Boston, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and threw hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was a bold statement of defiance against British rule, and George's support for the action was unwavering. In the months that followed, he worked tirelessly to build a coalition of like-minded individuals who shared his commitment to American rights and liberties. His correspondence with other prominent patriots, including Samuel Adams and John Adams, reveals a deepening sense of purpose and conviction, as well as a growing recognition of the need for collective action against British tyranny. In 1774, George's leadership role in the Patriot movement was formally acknowledged when he was appointed to the First Continental Congress, a gathering of delegates from 12 colonies who met in Philadelphia to coordinate a unified response to British aggression. The Congress, which convened on September 5, 1774, was a milestone in American history, marking the first time that representatives from the various colonies had come together to address their shared grievances and forge a common strategy for resistance. George's presence at the Congress was instrumental in shaping the agenda and tone of the proceedings, as he worked closely with other delegates to draft a series of resolutions and petitions that would be presented to the British government. One of the most significant outcomes of the First Continental Congress was the adoption of the Association, a pact signed by the delegates on October 20, 1774, in which they agreed to impose a boycott on British goods and to suspend all trade with Great Britain until their grievances were addressed. George's support for the association was enthusiastic, and he played a key role in promoting its implementation throughout Virginia. His commitment to the cause was evident in his correspondence with other patriots, as well as in his public statements, which reflected a deepening sense of urgency and resolve. As the association took hold, George's efforts to promote its implementation throughout Virginia were instrumental in galvanizing public support for the Patriot cause. In December 1774, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he played a key role in shaping the colony's response to British aggression. In January 1775, George was appointed to a committee tasked with drafting a plan for the defense of Virginia, which included the formation of a militia and the procurement of arms and ammunition. His experience in the French and Indian War had prepared him well for this task, and his leadership helped to ensure that the colony was adequately prepared for the coming conflict. As tensions escalated, George's commitment to the Patriot cause only grew stronger, and he became increasingly vocal in his criticism of British rule. In March 1775, George attended the Second Virginia Convention, where he was elected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, which was set to convene in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. This gathering would prove to be a pivotal moment in American history, as it marked the beginning of a unified colonial resistance against British rule. As the Continental Congress convened, news arrived of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which had taken place on April 19, 1775. The outbreak of war had begun, and George's experience as a military commander made him an obvious choice to lead the colonial forces. On June 15, 1775, he was unanimously elected as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, a position that would require him to leave his family and estate behind and embark on a perilous journey to Boston, where the war was raging. George's decision to accept the appointment was not taken lightly, and he was deeply aware of the risks and challenges that lay ahead. In a letter to his wife Martha, he wrote of his sense of duty and obligation to the Patriot cause, as well as his fear for the future and the uncertainty of the outcome. Despite these doubts, George's commitment to the American Revolution remained unwavering, and he set out for Boston with a sense of purpose and resolve that would guide him throughout the long and difficult years ahead. As he traveled north, George was greeted as a hero by the colonists, who saw in him a symbol of hope and resistance against British tyranny. His arrival in Boston on July 3, 1775, marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, as he set about organizing the Continental Army and preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The siege of Boston was ongoing, and George's leadership would be crucial in determining the outcome of the conflict. With his experience and expertise, he quickly set to work assessing the situation and developing a strategy to drive the British out of the city. As George Washington arrived in Boston on July 3, 1775, he was greeted by the sight of a city under siege. The Continental Army, a ragtag force of militiamen from various colonies, had been attempting to drive the British out of the city since April, but with limited success. Washington's first task was to assess the situation and develop a strategy to break the stalemate. He spent the next few days touring the defenses, meeting with his generals, and gathering intelligence on the British Army. One of his earliest decisions was to reorganize the Continental Army into a more formal structure, with clear lines of command and communication. He established a council of war, comprising his most senior generals, including Artemus Ward, Israel Putnam, and William Prescott, to advise him on key decisions. Washington also recognized the need for discipline and training within the army, and he set about establishing a rigorous regimen of drills, maneuvers, and inspections to improve the troops' performance. As he settled into his new role, Washington became increasingly aware of the logistical challenges facing the Continental Army. The army was woefully short of supplies, including ammunition, food, and equipment, and Washington knew that he had to find a way to address these shortages if he was to have any hope of success against the British. He turned to the New England colonies for support, appealing to their governors and legislatures for assistance in provisioning the army. In August 1775, Washington received a visit from Benjamin Franklin, who had been sent by the Continental Congress to offer his support and guidance. Franklin's vast experience and knowledge of diplomacy, science, and politics made him an invaluable asset to Washington, and the two men quickly formed a close bond. Franklin's advice on matters ranging from military strategy to international relations would prove instrumental in shaping Washington's decisions over the coming months. As the summer drew to a close, Washington turned his attention to the British Army, which was still entrenched in Boston. He knew that he had to find a way to drive them out of the city if he was to secure a decisive victory for the Continental Army. Washington began to explore options for launching a siege against the British, using a combination of artillery, infantry, and clever tactics to wear them down. He also started to consider the possibility of attacking the British by sea, using a fleet of privateers and naval vessels to blockade their supply lines and cut off their escape routes. In September 1775, Washington received intelligence that the British were planning to abandon Boston and sail for New York, where they hoped to establish a new base of operations. Washington knew that he had to act quickly to prevent this from happening, and he began to make plans for a bold and daring operation to capture the city and drive the British out of America once and for all. Over the winter of 1775 to 76, Washington worked tirelessly to prepare his army for the challenges ahead. He oversaw the construction of new fortifications, the training of his troops, and the acquisition of much-needed supplies. He also devoted considerable time to corresponding with his generals, governors, and other key allies, building a network of support and coordination that would be essential in the months to come. In January 1776, Washington's efforts were boosted by the arrival of a large shipment of artillery from Ticonderoga, which had been captured by American forces under the command of Ethan Allen. The guns, which included heavy cannons and mortars, gave Washington the firepower he needed to launch a serious assault on the British positions in Boston. He began to make plans for a major attack, using his new artillery to blast the British out of their fortified positions and drive them out of the city. As the snow began to thaw in March 1776, Washington put his plan into action. He ordered his troops to occupy Dorchester Heights, a strategic location that overlooked the city and commanded the harbor. From this vantage point, American artillery could bombard the British ships and fortifications, making it impossible for them to remain in Boston. The British commander, General William Howe, realized that his position was untenable and began to make plans to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, the British army set sail from Boston, leaving behind a city that was badly damaged but finally free from occupation. Washington's victory was a major milestone in the war, marking the first time that American forces had driven the British out of a major city. As he entered Boston on March 18th, Washington was greeted as a hero by the citizens, who cheered and wept with joy at their newfound freedom. As Washington entered Boston on March 18, 1776, he was greeted by the city's residents, who were eager to express their gratitude for his role in liberating them from British occupation. The city, however, was not without its challenges, and Washington soon found himself faced with the task of restoring order and stability to the community. He worked closely with the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to establish a new government and to address the various issues that had arisen during the occupation, including the distribution of food and supplies to those in need. In the weeks that followed, Washington's attention turned to the defense of New York, which he knew would be the British Army's next target. He began to make plans for the city's defense, recognizing that it would be a crucial battleground in the war. In April 1776, he traveled to New York, where he met with General Philip Schuyler and other military leaders to discuss the city's defenses. Washington was concerned about the city's vulnerability to attack, particularly from the sea, and he worked to strengthen its fortifications and to prepare his troops for the battles that lay ahead. As the spring of 1776 wore on, Washington's thoughts turned to the broader strategic implications of the war. He knew that the British Army would not give up easily, and that the Continental Army would need to be prepared to fight a long and difficult campaign. In May 1776, he wrote to the Continental Congress, urging them to take steps to strengthen the army and to provide it with the resources it needed to win the war. He also began to think about the possibility of foreign alliances, recognizing that the support of other countries could be crucial in helping the Americans to achieve their goal of independence. In June 1776, Washington received news that the Continental Congress had drafted a Declaration of Independence, which would formally announce the colony's separation from Great Britain. He was pleased by this development, which he saw as a necessary step toward securing American freedom. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, and Washington ordered that it be read to his troops in New York. The document's eloquent statement of American principles and its bold assertion of independence from Great Britain helped to galvanize support for the war effort, and Washington knew that it would be an important tool in rallying the American people behind the cause of liberty. As the summer of 1776 wore on, Washington's attention turned to the defense of New York, which was now under threat from a large British army led by General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe. The British forces had arrived off the coast of New York in June, and Washington knew that they would soon launch a major attack on the city. He worked tirelessly to prepare his troops for the battle ahead, recognizing that it would be one of the most important fights of the war. In August 1776, the British Army launched its attack, landing on Long Island and beginning a campaign that would ultimately drive the Continental Army out of New York. The Battle of Long Island, which took place on August 27, 1776, was a decisive defeat for the Americans, and Washington was forced to retreat from the island to avoid being trapped by the British. He then retreated to Manhattan, where he established a new defensive position at Harlem Heights. The British Army followed, and on September 15, 1776, they launched an attack on the American positions, hoping to drive them out of the city. However, Washington's troops held firm, and the British were repelled with heavy losses. Despite this small victory, Washington knew that his position in New York was untenable, and he began to make plans to retreat from the city. In October 1776, he led his army north through Manhattan and into Westchester County, where they established a new defensive position at White Plains. The British Army followed, and on October 28, 1776, they launched an attack on the American positions, hoping to crush the Continental Army once and for all. However, Washington's troops were well prepared and they repelled the British attack with ease. As the fall of 1776 wore on, Washington's thoughts turned to the future of the war. He also began to think about the possibility of launching a counterattack against the British, recognizing that this could be an effective way to regain the initiative and to ultimately secure American independence. In December 1776, Washington's army was stationed in New Jersey, where they were struggling to stay warm and fed in the face of a harsh winter. The British Army, led by General Charles Cornwallis, had occupied much of the state, and Washington knew that he needed to act quickly to prevent them from gaining control of the entire region. On December 25, 1776, he launched a daring raid across the Delaware River, hoping to catch the Hessian forces stationed in Trenton off guard. The attack was a brilliant success, and the Hessians were quickly defeated. Washington's victory at Trenton was a much-needed boost to American morale, and it helped to prove that the Continental Army was still a force to be reckoned with. As the news of Washington's victory at Trenton spread, it galvanized support for the Continental Army and boosted morale among the troops. The success of the daring raid also demonstrated Washington's ability to adapt and innovate in the face of adversity, a quality that would serve him well in the trials to come. In the aftermath of the battle, Washington's forces remained in New Jersey, where they continued to harass and disrupt British supply lines, forcing General Cornwallis to divert troops from his main army to deal with the persistent American threat. Meanwhile, Washington faced a new challenge as the enlistment terms for many of his soldiers were set to expire at the end of the year. Faced with the prospect of losing a significant portion of his army, Washington appealed to his men to remain in service, emphasizing the importance of their mission and the sacrifices they had already made. His words had a profound impact, and on January 1, 1777, many of the soldiers who had been scheduled to leave re-enlisted, providing a much-needed infusion of experienced troops for the Continental Army. As the new year began, Washington's attention turned to the need to reform and professionalize his army. He recognized that the amateurish and disorganized nature of the Continental Army had been a major hindrance in its early campaigns, and he was determined to create a more disciplined and effective fighting force. To achieve this goal, he appointed Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian military officer with extensive experience, as the army's inspector general. Von Steuben quickly set to work, implementing a rigorous training program that emphasized drill, discipline, and tactical proficiency. Under von Steuben's tutelage, the Continental Army began to take on a more professional character, with soldiers learning to march, maneuver, and fight in a coordinated and effective manner. Washington was delighted with the progress his army was making, and he saw the potential for a major breakthrough in the war effort. As the winter of 1777 drew to a close, he began to plan for a new campaign, one that would take advantage of the improved capabilities of his army and strike a decisive blow against the British. In February 1777, Washington launched a series of raids against British outposts in New Jersey, hoping to weaken their grip on the state and create an opportunity for a larger-scale attack. The raids were successful, and Washington's forces were able to capture several key positions, including the strategic town of Princeton. The British responded by launching a counterattack, but Washington's army was now better trained and more confident, and they were able to repel the assault with ease. As the spring of 1777 approached, Washington's thoughts turned to the possibility of a major British offensive, one that would seek to crush the Continental Army once and for all. He knew that the British commander, General William Howe, was planning something big, but he was unsure what form it would take or where it would be directed. To prepare for the coming battle, Washington ordered his army to begin constructing a series of defensive fortifications in the hills and mountains of New Jersey, hoping to create a secure base from which to launch counterattacks against the British. As the spring of 1777 unfolded, Washington's anticipation of a major British offensive proved well-founded. In June, General William Howe launched a campaign to capture Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies and the seat of the Continental Congress. Howe's army sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, intent on approaching Philadelphia from the south, while a smaller force under General John Burgoyne marched down from Canada, aiming to split the colonies and gain control of the Hudson River Valley. Washington, aware of the dual threats, divided his army to confront both enemies. He sent General Horatio Gates to lead the northern department against Burgoyne, while he himself took command of the main army to face Howe. Washington's forces marched south through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, seeking to intercept Howe's army before it could reach Philadelphia. On September 11, 1777, the two armies clashed at Brandywine Creek near Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. The British launched a series of frontal assaults against the American lines, which initially held firm but eventually began to falter. As the day wore on, Washington's troops were forced to retreat, and Howe's army claimed victory. Although the defeat was significant, Washington's army remained intact, and he quickly regrouped his forces to continue the campaign. In the aftermath of Brandywine, Washington's relationship with his subordinate officers came under strain. General Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most trusted advisors, had disagreed with his decision to engage the British at Brandywine, advocating instead for a more cautious approach. Despite this disagreement, Washington continued to value Greene's counsel and relied on him heavily in the days that followed. Meanwhile, General Charles Lee, a veteran of the British Army who had defected to the American cause, began to question Washington's leadership, suggesting that he was too inexperienced to command the Continental Army. Washington, aware of Lee's criticisms, remained confident in his own abilities and continued to make key decisions about the direction of the war effort. As the summer drew to a close, Washington's army settled into a defensive position at Germantown, just outside Philadelphia. On October 7, 1777, he launched a surprise attack against the British forces occupying the city, hoping to catch them off guard and drive them out. The Battle of Germantown was fierce, but ultimately unsuccessful, as a combination of poor weather, confusing orders, and stout British resistance thwarted the American advance. Despite this setback, Washington's army remained in high spirits, buoyed by the knowledge that they had come close to defeating the British in a major engagement. As the autumn of 1777 set in, Washington's army settled into a defensive position at White Marsh, Pennsylvania, where they established a fortified encampment to withstand the coming winter. The British, under General William Howe, had occupied Philadelphia, and Washington's primary objective was to prevent them from expanding their control into the surrounding countryside. To achieve this, he ordered his troops to construct a series of earthworks and fortifications, including redoubts, abatis, and trenches, which would provide protection against potential British attacks. Meanwhile, Washington's relationship with General Nathanael Greene continued to deepen, as the two men worked closely together to plan and execute the Continental Army strategy. Greene, who had initially disagreed with Washington's decision to engage the British at Brandywine, had come to respect his commander's judgment and tactical acumen. In turn, Washington relied heavily on Greene's expertise and counsel, often seeking his advice on matters ranging from troop deployments to logistics and supply chain management. As the winter of 1777-78 wore on, Washington's army faced numerous challenges, including inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. The harsh weather conditions and lack of resources took a heavy toll on the troops, with many suffering from disease, hunger, and exposure. Despite these difficulties, Washington remained resolute, using his charisma and leadership skills to maintain morale and discipline within the ranks. He also worked tirelessly to secure supplies and equipment, often personally intervening to resolve disputes with local contractors and suppliers. In February 1778, Washington appointed a new officer to oversee the Continental Army's training and drill, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian military veteran who had recently arrived in America. Steuben, who would later become one of Washington's most trusted advisors, brought a wealth of experience and expertise to the role, having served as a captain in the Prussian Army during the 7 Years' War. Under Steuben's guidance, the Continental Army began to undergo a significant transformation, as he introduced new training methods, tactics, and discipline that would eventually help to turn the tide of the war. As the winter slowly receded, Washington's thoughts turned to the coming campaign season and the possibility of launching a major offensive against the British. He knew that General Howe's army was still occupying Philadelphia, and that a decisive victory could potentially drive them out of the city and shift the balance of power in favor of the Americans. In the midst of these strategic deliberations, Washington received news that General Henry Clinton had replaced General William Howe as the commander-in-chief of the British Army in America. Clinton, who was known for his cautious and defensive approach to warfare, would eventually prove to be a more formidable opponent than Howe, as he sought to exploit the weaknesses of the Continental Army and crush the American rebellion once and for all. Washington, aware of the challenges that lay ahead, remained focused on his primary objective, to defeat the British and secure American independence, no matter the cost or difficulty. As General Henry Clinton assumed command of the British Army in America, Washington closely monitored his movements, aware that a change in leadership often signaled a shift in strategy. In June 1778, Clinton began to evacuate British forces from Philadelphia, opting to consolidate his troops in New York City, which he deemed more defensible. Washington, sensing an opportunity to harass the retreating army, ordered his troops to prepare for a pursuit. The Continental Army, now bolstered by the training and discipline instilled by Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, set out to shadow the British columns, aiming to exploit any weaknesses or vulnerabilities that might arise during their withdrawal. On June 28, 1778, Washington's army clashed with Clinton's rearguard at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, a sweltering summer engagement that would test the mettle of both forces. The battle, fought in blistering heat, was marked by confusion, miscommunication, and ultimately, a stalemate. Although the Continental Army failed to inflict significant casualties on the British, they demonstrated their ability to stand toe-to-toe with their foes, trading volleys and enduring the harsh conditions. Washington, though disappointed by the inconclusive outcome, took heart from the bravery and resilience displayed by his troops. As the summer of 1778 drew to a close, Washington's attention turned to the looming threat of a French alliance with the Americans. In February of that year, France had formally recognized American independence, and Washington was keenly aware that this diplomatic coup could potentially shift the balance of power in their favor. He began to contemplate the strategic implications of a French alliance, recognizing that it could provide a significant boost to the Continental Army's morale, logistics, and military capabilities. In August 1778, Washington met with French Minister Conrad Alexandre Girard, who had arrived in America to discuss the terms of their alliance. Their conversations laid the groundwork for a fruitful partnership, one that would ultimately contribute to the defeat of the British. Meanwhile, Washington's relationship with General Nathanael Greene continued to deepen as the two men worked in tandem to address the Continental Army's logistical challenges. Greene, who had become Washington's most trusted subordinate, played a crucial role in overseeing the Army's supply chain, ensuring that troops received adequate provisions and equipment. His diligence and expertise helped to mitigate the effects of scarcity and want, which had long plagued the Continental Army. As the seasons passed, Washington came to rely increasingly on Greene's counsel, valuing his insight into the intricacies of military administration and strategy. In the autumn of 1778, Washington's army established a new encampment at Middlebrook, New Jersey, where they would spend the winter months. The harsh weather conditions and lack of resources continued to take their toll on the troops, but Washington's leadership and the training instilled by von Steuben helped to maintain morale and discipline within the ranks. As the year drew to a close, Washington reflected on the progress made by the Continental Army, acknowledging the significant challenges that still lay ahead. Despite these difficulties, he remained resolute in his determination to secure American independence, convinced that the fate of the nation hung in the balance. As the winter of 1778 to 79 dragged on, Washington's army at Middlebrook endured the usual hardships of cold, hunger, and disease. Despite these challenges, the commander-in-chief remained focused on the strategic situation, aware that the British were regrouping and reassessing their approach to the war. In January 1779, Washington received intelligence that the British were planning to launch a campaign against the southern colonies, aiming to exploit the region's loyalist sympathies and gain control of its vital ports. Recognizing the gravity of this threat, Washington began to contemplate a response, weighing the merits of dispatching troops to reinforce the southern armies against the need to maintain a strong presence in the north. In February 1779, Washington welcomed a visit from the Marquis de Lafayette, who had returned to America after a brief sojourn in France. The young nobleman brought news of the French court's growing commitment to the American cause, as well as a personal message from King Louis XVI, expressing his admiration for Washington's leadership and his desire to strengthen the alliance between their nations. Washington was pleased by this development, recognizing that French support would be crucial in the coming months. He spent several days in conversation with Lafayette, discussing everything from military strategy to the intricacies of French court politics. As the spring of 1779 approached, Washington's thoughts turned to the impending campaign season. He knew that the British would likely launch a series of attacks against American positions, aiming to weaken his army and gain control of key territories. To counter this threat, Washington began to formulate a plan to attack the British outpost at Stony Point, which controlled access to the Hudson River. In May 1779, he dispatched a force of 1,500 troops under the command of General Anthony Wayne, with orders to capture the outpost and disrupt British supply lines. The ensuing battle was fierce and intense, with American troops using innovative tactics to overcome the British defenses. Although the victory at Stony Point was not decisive in itself, it marked an important turning point in the war, demonstrating that Washington's army could adapt and innovate in response to changing circumstances. Throughout the summer of 1779, Washington's army remained on high alert, responding to British raids and probes along the Hudson River. In July, he received news that a French fleet under the command of Admiral Charles Hector, Comte d'Estaing, had arrived off the coast of New York, bringing with it a large contingent of troops and supplies. Washington was eager to coordinate with the French, recognizing that their combined forces could potentially trap the British Army in New York City. However, the French admiral's decision to sail for Newport, Rhode Island, rather than attacking New York directly, frustrated Washington's plans and highlighted the challenges of coordinating Allied operations. In August 1779, Washington faced a new challenge when a large force of British and Hessian troops, under the command of General Wilhelm von Keyphasen, launched a raid against American positions in New Jersey. The enemy army was repelled, but not before it had burned and looted several towns, leaving many civilians homeless and destitute. Washington was outraged by this behavior, which he saw as a violation of the laws of war. He responded by issuing a stern rebuke to von Keyphasen, warning him that such actions would only serve to prolong the conflict and increase its brutality. As the summer of 1779 drew to a close, Washington's army continued to face numerous challenges, from maintaining morale and discipline among his troops to managing the complex web of alliances and rivalries with European powers. In September, he received news that the French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing had sailed for the West Indies, leaving him to wonder if the promised support from France would ever materialize. In October 1779, Washington welcomed a visit from the Continental Congress's Committee on Foreign Affairs, which had come to discuss the latest developments in European diplomacy. The committee, led by Benjamin Franklin, brought news of the French government's growing commitment to the American cause, as well as rumors of a possible alliance between France and Spain against Britain. Washington was heartened by this development, recognizing that a broader coalition of European powers could help shift the balance of the war in America's favor. As the winter of 1779 to 1880 approached, Washington's army settled into its usual routine of cold, hunger, and hardship. Despite these challenges, the commander-in-chief remained determined to maintain a strong presence in the north, recognizing that the British would likely launch a series of attacks against American positions in the coming year. In December 1779, he dispatched a force of troops under the command of General Nathaniel Greene to reinforce the Southern armies, which were struggling to contain the British advance in Georgia and the Carolinas. In January 1780, Washington received news that the British had launched a major campaign against Charleston, South Carolina, with a large fleet and army under the command of General Sir Henry Clinton. As he pored over maps and intelligence reports, he became increasingly convinced that the key to winning the war lay in coordinating American and French forces to launch a decisive blow against the British. In February 1780, Washington welcomed a visit from the Chevalier de la Luzerne, the new French minister to the United States, who brought news of the French government's growing commitment to the American cause. La Luzerne was a charming and sophisticated diplomat, with a deep understanding of European politics and a strong sympathy for the American Revolution. Over several days of conversation, Washington and La Luzerne discussed everything from military strategy to the intricacies of French court politics, laying the foundation for a close and enduring partnership between the two men. To counter this threat, Washington began to formulate a plan to attack the British outpost at New York City, recognizing that a decisive blow against the enemy's main base could help shift the balance of the war in America's favor. However, he also knew that such an operation would require careful planning and coordination with his French allies, as well as a significant infusion of troops and supplies. In March 1780, Washington received news that the French government had agreed to send a large expeditionary force to America under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau. This development was a major turning point in the war, as it promised to bring significant new resources and expertise to the American cause. Over the coming weeks and months, Washington worked closely with La Luzerne and other French officials to coordinate the arrival of the expeditionary force, recognizing that the successful integration of French and American troops would be crucial to the outcome of the war. As the spring of 1780 unfolded, Washington's attention turned to the impending arrival of the Comte de Rochambeau's expeditionary force. He worked tirelessly to coordinate the French troops' integration into the Continental Army, recognizing that a unified command structure and clear lines of communication would be essential to the success of their joint operations. In May 1780, Washington traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, where he met with Rochambeau to discuss their strategy for the upcoming campaign season. The two men quickly established a strong rapport, despite the challenges posed by their language differences and the complexities of coalition warfare. Their conversations focused on the possibility of launching a joint attack against the British forces in New York City, with Washington emphasizing the importance of securing a decisive victory to shift the balance of the war in America's favor. Rochambeau, however, was more cautious, advocating for a more measured approach that would allow the French troops to become familiar with the terrain and the enemy's dispositions before committing to a major battle. Washington respected Rochambeau's reservations, recognizing that the French commander's experience and expertise would be invaluable in the months ahead. As the summer of 1780 wore on, Washington and Rochambeau continued to refine their plans, taking into account the intelligence they received about British troop movements and dispositions. In July 1780, they learned that a large British fleet had sailed from New York City, bound for the Chesapeake Bay, where it would support a major campaign against the Continental Army's southern forces. Washington immediately realized that this development posed a significant threat to his own army's position in the north, as it could potentially divert troops and resources away from the main theater of operations. In response to this new intelligence, Washington decided to dispatch a small contingent of troops under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette to reinforce the Continental Army's forces in Virginia. Lafayette, who had returned to America in April 1780 after a brief sojourn in France, was eager to prove himself in battle and quickly set about preparing his troops for the long march south. As he departed, Washington expressed his confidence in the young French nobleman, recognizing that his bravery, intelligence, and charisma would make him an invaluable asset in the campaigns ahead. Meanwhile, Washington's own army remained encamped in the vicinity of New York City, where it continued to face numerous challenges, including supply shortages, desertion, and the ever-present threat of British attack. Despite these difficulties, Washington's leadership and strategic vision helped to maintain morale and cohesion within the ranks, as he worked tirelessly to prepare his troops for the battles that lay ahead. In August 1780, he received a visit from Benjamin Franklin, who had recently returned from France, where he had secured significant financial and diplomatic support for the American cause. As Franklin sat with Washington, he shared news of the significant diplomatic strides made in France, where he had secured a substantial loan to support the American war effort. This development was a major boost to Washington's plans, as it would enable him to maintain his army in the field and potentially launch more aggressive operations against the British. The two men spent hours discussing the implications of this new funding, exploring ways to allocate the resources effectively and maximize their impact on the battlefield. Franklin also brought news of the growing sentiment in France in favor of the American cause, with many influential figures now openly advocating for recognition of American independence. Washington was heartened by these developments, recognizing that the tide of international opinion was beginning to shift in America's favor. He knew that this growing support would be crucial in securing the diplomatic recognition and material aid needed to ultimately defeat the British. As he conversed with Franklin, Washington couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and vindication, knowing that his own leadership and strategic vision had played a significant role in bringing about this shift in fortunes. The two men's conversation was filled with a sense of hope and optimism as they contemplated the possibilities that lay ahead for the American cause. In the weeks that followed, Washington worked tirelessly to prepare his army for the upcoming campaign season. He spent long hours reviewing troop dispositions, inspecting defensive works, and meeting with his senior officers to discuss strategy and tactics. The arrival of the French expeditionary force under Rochambeau had added a new layer of complexity to Washington's planning, as he sought to integrate the French troops into his own command structure and coordinate their operations effectively. Despite the challenges posed by language barriers and cultural differences, Washington was determined to make the most of this newfound alliance, recognizing that the combined strength of the American and French armies could be a decisive factor in the war. As the summer wore on, Washington's attention turned to the British Army under General Henry Clinton, which remained encamped in New York City. Washington knew that Clinton's forces posed a significant threat to his own army's position, and he was determined to do everything in his power to prevent the British from launching a major attack. To this end, he ordered a series of reconnaissance missions and raids against British outposts, seeking to gather intelligence on enemy dispositions and disrupt their supply lines. These operations were carried out with skill and daring by Washington's most trusted subordinates, including men like Henry Knox and Nathanael Greene, who had proven themselves time and again in battle. In August 1780, Washington received a visit from the Comte de Rochambeau, who had traveled to American headquarters to discuss the upcoming campaign. The two men spent several days reviewing maps and strategy, exploring possibilities for a joint attack against the British forces in New York City. Rochambeau was impressed by Washington's knowledge of the terrain and his grasp of the strategic situation, and he began to see the American general as a true partner in their shared endeavor. As they conversed, Washington emphasized the importance of securing a decisive victory, one that would shatter the British Army's morale and pave the way for American independence. As the summer of 1780 drew to a close, Washington's discussions with Rochambeau centered on the possibility of a joint attack against the British forces in New York City. The two generals pored over maps and strategized about the best ways to exploit the weaknesses in the British defenses. Washington was impressed by Rochambeau's experience and knowledge of European warfare, and he valued the French general's insights into the strengths and vulnerabilities of the British Army. Meanwhile, Rochambeau was struck by Washington's mastery of the American terrain and his deep understanding of the colonial militia system. In September 1780, Washington received news that Benedict Arnold, one of his most trusted generals, had defected to the British. This shocking betrayal sent shockwaves through the Continental Army, and Washington was forced to reevaluate his plans for the upcoming campaign. He knew that Arnold's defection would give the British valuable intelligence about American troop dispositions and strategic intentions, and he took immediate steps to counter this threat. Washington ordered a thorough review of security protocols and intensified efforts to gather intelligence on British movements. As the autumn of 1780 progressed, Washington's focus turned to the Southern Theater, where British forces under General Charles Cornwallis were making significant gains. Washington knew that the loss of the southern colonies would be a devastating blow to the American cause, and he worked tirelessly to coordinate a response to the British threat. He dispatched General Nathaniel Greene to take command of the Southern Army, and he provided him with detailed instructions on how to counter the British strategy. In October 1780, Washington traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, where he met with Rochambeau to discuss the progress of the war. The two generals reviewed the military situation and agreed on a plan to launch a joint attack against the British in New York City. They also discussed the possibility of receiving additional French troops and supplies, which would be crucial in tipping the balance of the war in favor of the Americans. As the winter of 1780 to 1881 approached, Washington's army faced significant challenges in terms of supply and morale. The harsh weather conditions and lack of resources took a toll on the troops, and desertion rates began to rise. Washington responded by launching a series of campaigns to gather food and supplies, and he worked to boost morale through a combination of inspiration and discipline. He also took steps to improve the Army's training and tactical preparedness, recognizing that the upcoming campaign would be decisive in determining the outcome of the war. In January 1781, Washington received news that a large French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse was sailing for the American coast. This development offered a significant opportunity for the Americans to gain the upper hand against the British, and Washington quickly began making plans to coordinate with the French admiral. He knew that the combined might of the American and French forces could be enough to crush the British Army and secure American independence. As the winter of 1780 to 1881 slowly receded, Washington's thoughts turned to the impending arrival of Admiral de Grasse's fleet, which was expected to play a crucial role in the upcoming campaign. He knew that the French admiral's ships would be instrumental in gaining control of the Chesapeake Bay, thereby cutting off British General Charles Cornwallis's lines of supply and communication. In February 1781, Washington traveled to New Windsor, New York, where he met with General Rochambeau to finalize plans for the joint campaign against the British. The two generals pored over maps and discussed the logistics of coordinating their forces, with Washington emphasizing the importance of timing and surprise in catching the British off guard. Meanwhile, Washington's attention was also focused on the Southern Theater, where General Nathaniel Greene was struggling to counter the British Army's advances. In January 1781, Greene had won a significant victory at the Battle of Cowpens, but he still faced considerable challenges in terms of manpower and resources. Washington responded by dispatching additional troops and supplies to Greene's army, while also providing him with strategic guidance and advice on how to exploit the British weaknesses. As the spring of 1781 approached, Washington's confidence in Greene's abilities grew, and he began to see the Southern Theater as a potential area of opportunity for the Americans. In March 1781, Washington received news that Admiral de Grasse's fleet had arrived off the coast of Virginia, and he quickly began making plans to coordinate with the French admiral. Washington's thoughts turned to the possibility of a decisive battle, one that would determine the outcome of the war and shape the future of the young American nation. As he pondered the challenges ahead, Washington's mind was filled with visions of victory and liberation, and he steeled himself for the sacrifices and hardships that lay ahead. The two generals agreed on a strategy that would involve a coordinated attack on British forces in New York and Virginia, with the goal of trapping Cornwallis's army between the American and French forces. Washington was impressed by Rochambeau's grasp of the strategic situation, and he valued the French general's insights into the strengths and weaknesses of the British Army. As they parted ways, Washington felt a sense of optimism and hope that he had not felt in years, and he knew that the fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance. As the spring of 1781 unfolded, Washington's strategic plans began to take shape. He spent countless hours poring over maps and dispatches, coordinating with his French allies, and assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the British Army. In May, he traveled to Philadelphia to meet with members of Congress, where he lobbied for increased support and resources for the war effort. His efforts paid off, as Congress agreed to provide additional funds and troops to bolster the Continental Army. Meanwhile, Washington's attention remained fixed on the Southern Theater, where General Nathaniel Greene continued to harass and disrupt British forces. In April, Greene had scored a significant victory at the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, and Washington saw an opportunity to build on this momentum. He dispatched additional troops and supplies to Greene's army, urging him to press his advantage and drive the British back. As the summer months approached, Washington turned his attention to the campaign against General Charles Cornwallis, who had marched his army into Virginia in pursuit of American forces. Washington saw an opportunity to trap Cornwallis between the American and French armies, and he began making plans for a coordinated attack. In July, he traveled to Albany, New York, where he met with General Rochambeau to finalize their strategy. The two generals pored over maps and dispatches, discussing the finer points of their plan. They agreed that the key to success lay in controlling the Chesapeake Bay, which would allow them to cut off Cornwallis's supply lines and prevent his escape. To achieve this, they would need to combine their forces with those of Admiral de Grasse, whose fleet was expected to arrive in the bay later that summer. As Washington and Rochambeau parted ways, they shared a sense of optimism and anticipation. They knew that the coming campaign would be decisive and that the fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance. Over the next few weeks, Washington worked tirelessly to prepare his army for the battles ahead, drilling his troops and making final preparations for the march south. In August, Washington's army set out from New York, bound for Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay. The journey was long and arduous, but Washington's men were buoyed by their sense of purpose and the prospect of a decisive victory. As they marched, Washington received dispatches from Admiral de Grasse, who reported that his fleet had arrived in the bay and was preparing to support the American and French armies. Washington's army, combined with the forces of General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, would soon face off against Cornwallis's army in a battle that would determine the outcome of the Revolution. The fate of America hung in the balance, and Washington was ready to do whatever it took to secure victory and independence for his country. In September, Washington's army arrived at the outskirts of Yorktown, Virginia, where they began preparing for the siege of Cornwallis's army. The British general had entrenched himself behind a series of fortifications, but Washington was confident that he could breach these defenses with the support of his French allies and Admiral de Grasse's fleet. As the siege began, Washington's troops worked tirelessly to dig trenches and build earthworks, slowly closing in on the British lines. Cornwallis, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, attempted to escape across the York River, but a storm destroyed his boats and prevented his departure. With no hope of escape or relief, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. On October 19, 1781, Washington's army, supported by the French and Admiral de Grasse's fleet, accepted the British general's surrender, marking a decisive victory for the Americans and their allies. The Battle of Yorktown would prove to be the last major conflict of the war, and it paved the way for the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, formally ending the American Revolution and recognizing American independence. In the aftermath of the battle, Washington was hailed as a hero, his reputation as a military leader cemented by his victory at Yorktown. He remained in Virginia for several weeks, overseeing the surrender of British troops and ensuring that the terms of the capitulation were carried out. As he prepared to return to New York, he was filled with a sense of pride and satisfaction, knowing that his years of hard work and dedication had finally paid off. The journey back to New York was a triumphant one as Washington's army marched through the countryside, cheered on by crowds of jubilant citizens. Along the way, Washington stopped at Mount Vernon, where he was greeted by his wife Martha and other family members. For a brief moment, he was able to relax and enjoy the company of his loved ones, basking in the glow of his recent victory. As he spent time at Mount Vernon, Washington began to re-engage with his life as a planter and gentleman farmer, overseeing the management of his estate and experimenting with new crops and farming techniques. He also started to think about the future of the country he had helped to create, and in November 1783, he wrote to James Madison, expressing his concerns about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the need for a stronger central government. In December 1783, Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, marking the end of his military career. He was feted with parades, ceremonies, and speeches, and on December 23rd, he returned to Mount Vernon, where he was greeted as a hero by his family, friends, and neighbors. Over the next few years, Washington continued to manage his estate, experimenting with new crops and farming techniques, and also became increasingly involved in national politics. In 1785, he hosted a conference at Mount Vernon, where he met with representatives from Maryland and Virginia to discuss trade and navigation issues related to the Potomac River. In 1786, Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, passed away at the age of 81, and he was deeply affected by her death. He had always been close to his mother, and her passing marked the end of an era for him. In the same year, he also began to experience health problems, including rheumatism and toothaches, which would plague him for the rest of his life. In 1787, Washington was persuaded to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he played a key role in shaping the United States Constitution. He was unanimously elected as the convention's president, and his presence helped to lend credibility and gravity to the proceedings. Although he did not speak often during the convention, his influence was significant, and he worked behind the scenes to build support for the new Constitution. After the Constitutional Convention, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, where he continued to manage his estate and participate in national politics. In 1789, he was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, and on April 30th, he took the oath of office on the steps of Federal Hall in New York City. As president, Washington established many of the customs and traditions that would shape the office for generations to come. He served 2 terms from 1789 to 1797, and during that time, he faced numerous challenges, including the Whiskey Rebellion, conflicts with Native American tribes, and tensions with European powers. In 1797, Washington declined to run for a 3rd term as president, and on March 4th, he attended the inauguration of his successor, John Adams. He then returned to Mount Vernon, where he resumed his life as a planter and gentleman farmer. However, he continued to be involved in national politics, and in 1798 he was appointed as the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army in response to the threat of war with France. Over the next few years, Washington's health began to decline, and he suffered from a variety of ailments, including rheumatism, arthritis, and toothaches. In December 1799, he caught a cold, which quickly developed into a severe respiratory infection. He died on December 14, 1799, at his Mount Vernon estate, surrounded by his family and closest friends. Washington's death was met with an outpouring of grief from across the United States, and he was eulogized by politicians, clergy, and ordinary citizens alike. His funeral was held on December 18, 1799, and he was buried on the grounds of Mount Vernon in a family tomb that he had designed himself. In the months following his death, Washington's wife Martha worked to settle his estate and carry out his wishes regarding his property and personal effects. She died on May 22, 1802, and was buried alongside her husband at Mount Vernon. The couple's legacy continued to shape American history, and their memory remained an important part of the country's cultural heritage. His unwavering commitment to principle, his unshakable integrity, and his selfless dedication to the welfare of others have left an indelible mark on the United States and the world. As he so eloquently expressed, "It is better to offer no excuse than a bad one," a sentiment that encapsulates his character and serves as a guiding principle for generations to come. Washington's legacy extends far beyond his impressive list of accomplishments, for he has inspired countless individuals to strive for excellence, to persevere in the face of adversity, and to remain true to their values. His life stands as a testament to the transformative power of leadership, character, and vision. That's all for today's biography with Plutarch. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that understanding the lives of remarkable individuals helps us better understand ourselves.